Hi everybody, thank you for having me here tonight. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Great. So as you just heard in the introduction, my research focuses on not specifically Syrian refugees, but several countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So I've spent time researching and speaking with people in Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey. So tonight I'm going to focus on Egypt and Turkey. So I don't look specifically at Syrian refugees, but given when I started my research, which was in 2012, as you can see from this graph, that sort of was the beginning of this outward migration of Syrians from Syria, mostly into neighboring countries. So that really escalated into 2013 and 2014, and it's ongoing. Now, as you might have heard in the past couple of months, I'm sure you are aware of, there's been much focus on the influx of Syrian refugees into Europe. That's received a lot of media coverage. But as you can see, I hope you can see from this graphic, the majority of Syrian refugees are not in Europe, but in fact in neighboring countries, specifically Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and to a lesser extent, Egypt and Libya. So here's a focus then on the countries that I'm interested in, the neighboring countries to Syria. So the numbers that are represented here, which are from this year, 2015, these are from Amnesty International, they're actually just the registered Syrian refugees. So those are the Syrian refugees that have approached the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, and actually registered themselves as asylum seekers or refugees. So this doesn't account for all those who might, for various reasons, not choose to do that. So one misconception is that Syrian refugees, or specifically, or less specifically, refugees globally are housed in camps. And that is true in some cases, but actually the majority of not just Syrian refugees, but refugees globally are not in camps. They're in rural areas and in urban areas. So if we're talking about the Middle East, in Jordan, you might be familiar with some of the larger camps there, Zaatari or some other ones. And those do house significant numbers of refugees. But there are also significant numbers of refugees that live outside the camps in various locations. In Lebanon, there are no official camps, though some families have created sort of makeshift camps, and most actually live in cities and villages. In Turkey, there are government-run camps, and these have gotten quite a bit of publicity or news coverage because they're government-run by the Turkish government, and they're supposed to be quite hospitable as far as refugee camps go. But only 25% of all the refugees in Turkey are actually in these camps. So 75% of refugees are in urban areas outside of the camps. In Egypt, there are no camps. Most refugees live in either Cairo or northern coastal cities like Alexandria. And then in Iraq, there are government set up camps, but again, the majority of refugees live in urban areas. And I bring this up because it's relevant for the resettlement process. So because many refugees live outside of camps, it's sort of the onus is on refugees themselves to approach the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, and to actually begin the application process that would enable them to eventually become resettled. So I'm going to just walk through kind of the steps you have to go through as a refugee if you want to become eligible and actually complete the resettlement process. So the first step is to leave your country. You can only be considered a refugee once you've actually managed to flee from your country. The second step is once you arrive in a host country, often a neighboring country like the ones I mentioned, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, or Jordan, then you would probably seek out others like co-nationals from your country, and you might learn through them about the UNHCR. So the next step would be to approach the UNHCR. You do that by making an initial application. And you might have to wait several months, possibly even longer, before you hear back from the UNHCR and receive an appointment. And during that appointment, you'll go through an interview. And you'll explain your case, explain where you came from, members of your family will probably be present, and you'll make your case for resettlement. So if you're accepted as a refugee, if you are given that status, then the UNHCR will send your application on to a sponsor country. So usually these are countries like in North America or in Europe or maybe Australia. And that country can determine whether or not you're going to be accepted as a refugee in their country. So you go through additional security screening, probably health checks, and further interviews. And only then will you actually be accepted for resettlement. Then you're given things like pre-departure orientations, and then you're actually flown to that country. So this process varies very much by which country you're in, which is your host country, in that time period, as well as your nationality. So if you're Syrian versus maybe another nationality from an African country or Iraqi. But oftentimes it can take multiple years. So I say this to sort of explain my research, which is what happens to refugees during this time period when they're sort of in these so-called transit countries, and transit countries that can often turn into host countries by default. So one of the countries that I'm interested in is Egypt. And I'm just going to walk through a little bit of what the situation has been like for Syrians in Egypt over the past couple years since Syrians started coming. So Syrian refugees began arriving in Egypt in larger numbers in 2012. And when they initially arrived during this time period, former President Mohamed Morsi extended a relatively warm welcome to Syrian refugees. So they were given access to Egyptian schools, even if they hadn't registered with the UNHCR, so regardless of their legal status, children were able to attend public schools. They were allowed into Egypt without applying for an entry visa, so that also made it easier. They were encouraged to set up businesses. There were many Syrian restaurants popping up around this time. And in 2013, Morsi made his sort of position clear on where he fell within the Syrian refugee, or within the Syrian crisis. So he announced that the Syrian embassy would be closing and that the Egyptian people and army are supporting the Syrian uprising. So he took a very political stance. And then, after he was ousted by the Egyptian military on July 3rd, 2013, as a result of this link between former President Mohamed Morsi and the Syrian refugees, Syrians became the target of this government-organized media campaign that painted them as quote-unquote terrorists who were allied with the Muslim Brotherhood. So it became very problematic for Syrians in Egypt. That should say the post-2013 Egyptian government then imposed entry visas on Syrians, so it became harder to actually get into Egypt, and it also just became a lot more difficult on a day-to-day basis for Syrians. And really importantly, many of the Islamic organizations that have provided aid to Syrian refugees in this Morsi period were forced to shut down. So that cut off a lot of aid for people that had become sort of reliant upon that when they arrived in Egypt. And now I just want to share with you the story of one of the families that I spoke with. I'm not going to share their names for reasons of confidentiality, but this is a mother, a father, 6 children, and an elderly grandmother who's not pictured here. And when I spoke with them in the fall of 2014, they were living on the outskirts of Alexandria in a beach community that's populated by Egyptians during summer months, but in the winter and the rest of the year is relatively deserted. So the father has a stomach problem that prevents him from working, and he needs an operation. An Egyptian doctor that he saw with the help of the UNHCR and an organization called Caritas told him that the operation isn't possible in Egypt. So either he has to leave, either he has to live with the problem, or he has to travel outside Egypt in order to get medical help. When I asked his wife whether the family thought about paying a smuggler to get to Europe, like many of their Syrian neighbors had done, she told me she would gladly pay for passage on a boat, if only they had the money. So for a family of 9, that passage on one of these boats heading across the Mediterranean is quite unaffordable. Both the man and the woman, before that, the children are able to attend Egyptian public schools for free because they're registered as refugees with the UNHCR, but this still means extra expenses for the family. So the wife explained that she's had to buy pens, notebooks, books, all sorts of things that are these added expenses the family can't really afford. Both the man and woman told me that they previously received some assistance when they first got to Egypt in 2012, but after the military coup and the ousting of former President Mohamed Morsi, the assistance has mostly evaporated. Okay, now I'm going to go on to Turkey. So just a brief overview of the refugee situation in Turkey. So importantly, Turkey, it signed the 1951 Convention on relating to the status of the refugee, but it has these limitations to it. And really importantly, it has a geographical limitation. So this means that only refugees from European countries can be recognized as full refugees in Turkey. So practically speaking, this means only refugees from the Caucasus, or maybe Azerbaijan, or other European-related areas. And unfortunately, this means Syrians aren't eligible for full refugee status. So what Syrians have instead is called temporary protection. And this is a new category that was created under the 2013 law that Turkey passed on migration that sort of reformed its entire migration system. And so officially, Syrian refugees are considered guests by the Turkish government. So Syrians, once they arrive in Turkey, they have to first register with the Turkish authorities, so the Turkish government, if they want to receive this status, this temporary protection status. But if they want to become eligible for resettlement, they have to also register with the UNHCR. So there's this dual system operating in Turkey. And here this should say June 2015, I'm sorry. So as well, like Egypt, Syrian refugees have recently sort of become more of a politicized issue in Turkey. So around the time of the June 2015 elections, this was happening to a large extent. There was one nationalist party in particular that was threatening to send Syrian refugees that are currently residing in Turkey back to Syria as part of their election platform. And this might have just been political banter, but they were still sort of capitalizing on this mentality that's become, unfortunately, more pervasive in terms of we might not want to continue to have our tax dollars fund, government-run camps or other services that are being offered to Syrian refugees. So this is the sort of politicization that's a very recent phenomenon of the Syrian refugee issue. But on the upside, there is, in connection again with this 2013 migration law that was handed down, there is a forthcoming law that will address integration, and this could potentially offer things like Turkish language classes or cultural classes, other things relating to integration that is set to be handed down as part of this law that was passed. And in conjunction with that, there is a possible bill that would allow Syrians to be able to work more easily. But this was presented just prior to the election in Parliament, but it was sort of shelved because no one wanted to touch the issue during the election season. And now I'm just going to share with you a more personal story from another two individuals that I spoke with in Turkey. So these are the only two Syrian employees at a Turkish-owned kanafa restaurant near central Gaziantep. And Gaziantep is a city on the southeastern border, or it's in the southeast of Turkey on the border with Syria. Gaziantep is a city of about 1.5 million, and at the moment there are estimates of between 300,000 and 400,000 Syrian refugees living in the city. So that's like an additional quarter of the population. The woman here came to Gaziantep from Aleppo 3 years ago with her husband, her 2 sons and 1 daughter, and their spouses and children, all of whom live together in one apartment, 13 people in total. And she tells me that she thinks Turks have started to sort of turn against Syrians. She says, in the beginning it was different. They were happy to have us here, but now they don't want us anymore. And the man here, who's only 26, has been in Turkey for 9 months. In Syria he worked as a jeweler, but now he cleans floors and does other odd jobs around the kanafa restaurant. Well, the woman works 7-hour days, the man works 12-hour days, 6 days a week. He, his brother, his wife, his 6-month-old daughter, and 2 other Syrians share a 1-room apartment. I asked him about his family, and he says that his parents are still in Syria, along with his 2 sisters. They can't come to Gaziantep because he can't afford to pay for them, and they don't have enough money to come on their own. When I asked him about assistance from organizations, he told me, no, I've never gotten any help. The Turks think that all this money is being spent on Syrians and that we should be grateful, but we don't see any of the money. Where's the money going? There's no help for Syrians in Gaziantep. But even though the 3 sort of cases I presented all sort of attest to this lack of assistance and lack of aid. There are actually a large number of organizations, both international and local, who do provide services and aid for Syrians and for other refugees and migrants in these countries, Egypt and Turkey. I've listed the ones that I was able to speak with, but there are others. The problem is really just a matter of capacity. They don't necessarily have the capacity to outreach to all the different Syrians and other migrant and refugee groups that are living in these countries. So, as some sort of takeaway points from this. This year, Syrians surpassed Afghans to become the largest refugee group. But there are still 2.6 million Afghans worldwide, making them the second largest refugee group. Other refugee situations include Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and others that I haven't listed here. And so I bring up these numbers to show that the refugee crisis, the global refugee crisis, didn't begin and it won't end with the Syrian situation. This is an ongoing global phenomenon. And the number of successfully resettled refugees really pales in comparison to these figures. So if we're talking about Syrians or if we're talking about other groups, the numbers are just so insignificant when we talk about resettlement compared to the number of refugees that are out there. So in the absence of increased quotas, like drastically increased quotas, and the loosening of security restrictions that would allow more people to more easily access resettlement, what I would say is that the groups that are providing services to refugees in the Middle East and elsewhere, but I look specifically at the Middle East, they urgently need more funding in order to enhance their capacity and in order to reach more people. And another challenge is, of course, there's been this recent spotlight on the Syrian refugee crisis, and in some ways that is great. That's a great thing, because it means potentially that some of these groups will see more funding, will see their ability to serve more people and their capacity increase. But keeping that momentum going past the media spotlight on this issue is going to be a challenge, but it's necessary. Okay, so that's the end. Thank you very much.